Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us, this time in New York again. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know, but especially our listeners in Berlin, that we are doing our second live podcast taping event. And yeah, this time we're doing it right here in Berlin. So it's going to be the evening of May 25th at Prachtwerk, which is in Neukölln, the neighborhood here in Berlin. You can look that up online. Adam and I will be talking all things economic with a special emphasis on Germany. You can get tickets for this one-night-only event at podfestberlin.com or by checking the show notes for this episode. Adam and I are really excited to meet our Berlin listeners, so yeah, we hope to see you all there. But for now, we'll get back to our data point, something more from the news as usual, and the data point there is 9, as in the 9th of May, which is when Iran and Saudi Arabia are each supposed to reopen diplomatic missions in each other's countries.
Saudi Arabia and Iran are taking a major step to improve relations. At a gathering,
Saudi TV showed the foreign ministers from Iran and Saudi Arabia signing a landmark deal brokered.
These are the first significant steps towards normalization since the two restored relations last month.
And sometime thereafter, if Saudi Arabia takes up an invitation made this week, King Salman or his son, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who actually rules Saudi Arabia, could make a state visit to Tehran. So this follows years of estrangement and rivalry, which led to proxy military battles across the region from Yemen to Syria. It all seems like a pretty watershed moment for the region, signaling the potential, at least, for a lasting peace, one that the United States, interestingly enough, is not responsible for creating or overseeing. We thought we'd delve into whether that's actually the case, whether these countries have the economic and political power to create a new order on their own in the Middle East. So, Adam, we've talked before about the Saudi economy, and if I recall correctly, our conversation centered on Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil production. And I wonder, is that kind of economy a sufficient basis for being an independent power in global or regional politics, I suppose?
I mean, I think it depends a little bit on what you mean by independent. Clearly the fact that Saudi Arabia depends as heavily as it does on its 10 million barrels per day of oil exports, means that in a sense it relies on its customers to generate revenue. But conversely, it's such a big player in global oil markets that it exerts huge leverage. And you far more often, after all, hear stories and read stories about the way in which Saudi decisions will influence everyone else than the other way around. I mean, it accounts by itself for between 17 and 18% of total seaborne oil exports. And it's the controlling and deciding voice in OPEC, which now, by way of OPEC Plus, extends to Russia. And so is it truly autonomous, if you like? Is anyone really, in that sense, truly autonomous? Well, no, it depends on on exports, but it has far more leverage than the vast majority of other players in the global system. It's certainly a top tier, if you like, influencer of the world economy. And that power is further compounded by the fact that, unlike most economies, when we look at national economic exports of Germany, for instance, they're fragmented over literally tens of thousands of small companies. And even if you look at the concentrated group of the largest exporters, 20 to 30 companies are responsible for the biggest flow of German exports. In the Saudi case, it's one single entity, it's Saudi Aramco, which is one of the very few non-American companies in the top 10 of corporate size in the world. So it has this essential export. It's a huge player in that market globally. The exports that it does are concentrated in the hands of one company, and it has stored up Saudi Arabia in the form of reserves, $450 billion worth of assets. Now, as we know from the Russian case, depending on where you've put them, they can be vulnerable to impounding. But in the immediate term, that means that Saudi, especially in high oil price periods like the current one, is a major supplier of funding to the world economy, to the global dollar system in the form of petrodollars. That's not a lever you can easily pull, but it certainly means that you are one of the powers doing the pulling rather than being pulled, right? Saudi is not in the position of a desperate borrower that needs access to global credit. So, yes, I think by any realistic measure, Saudi's economic position, at least for the foreseeable future, gives it huge heft. And though we may, of course, imagine a world beyond fossil fuels, the Saudis are relatively calm and confident about that because they know that their production costs are the lowest in the world. And so for the residual remainder of oil demand, and there are no realistic models of energy transition which don't include some oil supply, Saudi will be the supplier of choice. So they envision a long future for themselves as a key energy provider. And in the energy space beyond, in the renewable energy space, with the amount of insulation they get, with the amount of solar radiation on the kingdom, they, of course, also imagine a future for themselves as a solar energy powerhouse.
Just to clarify here, I mean, this is interesting. It sounds like you're saying that a sort of non-diversified economy is actually a source of political strength in some ways. This kind of consolidated.
If it's organized in the form of a single state-owned corporation, then you don't have you have fewer coordination problems. Of course, you have the question of how you control the technocrats that run the business, but I don't think MBS has any doubt about his ability to do that if the push comes to shove. But certainly you don't, in the case of Germany, when we speak about it as an export champion, we are lumping together what is in fact essentially a private sector, very diverse, very complicated private sector over which the government has no direct influence, right? When we talk about Germany's export earnings, this is a figure of speech rather than a reality. Whereas in the Saudi case, it's literally the earnings of a state-owned company whose budget is essentially identical with that of the state. And so it's simple, it's crude, but it does indeed give you heft. And if it's something like oil, where we have a 30 to 40-year time horizon on it, it's yes, it does indeed give you security.
So Saudi Arabia seems to have had options in terms of its diplomatic pursuits. It had the choice of either further pursuing rapprochement with Iran that we've seen, or instead deepening this new regional relationship with Israel that's been represented by the Abraham Accords. In the past week or so, we've been hearing more about the Iran path, but which path seems to be more potentially transformative for the region to you, Adam?
Yes, I think this is an issue of, who does Saudi want to play with in the region and who does Saudi want to play with on the global stage? And I think those are the two things are interconnected, right? There are shifts going on at both in the regional level, but also on the global stage. And what the Abraham Accords sort of pointed to was, if you like, the kind of, I think, the limit of you might say a kind of relatively realistic American diplomacy, where you would try and organize a rapprochement between America's investment in Israel and America's long-term investment in the security of the Gulf states. I mean, for all of the disputes with Saudi Arabia over the Khashoggi killing and human rights and so on, it's undeniable that at least since the 1970s, the United States has made a gigantic investment in the security of the leading oil producers in the Gulf. And the Abraham Accords are one way of squaring that, with, of course, the proviso that Iran is then the target, essentially, of a double isolation from the Saudi side and the Israeli side. And having, as it were, seen the advantages of that and exploited them to a considerable degree and moved some way towards reopening relations with Israel, I think, faced with the continuing impasse on the American side, that America essentially wants you to do two things, which is normalize with Israel, which is difficult for any Arab state to do, and on the other hand, to isolate Iran, which is something that Saudi, can get on board with, given the tensions between the two states, which go back a long way, and given the natural, you could say, rivalry in the Gulf region. But it's also a limiting position. And so when new global players come along and the global configuration shifts, I think what we're seeing is the Saudis, as you say, exploring their options, which is another indicator, I think, of the degree of freedom that they have and of what's, the power that has entered the scene is China. I mean, Russia's been in the region for a long time. I mean, Iran's diplomacy, geopolitics can't be thought without Russia, its great northern neighbor. But China is a new player on the scene. And what many of the regional actors are discovering, I think, is in a world in which America is backing Israel, is confronting Iran, is confronting Russia, and is now confronting China as well, all of a sudden a variety of other options open up for you in regional diplomacy. And that's what the Saudis are doing. I think they've kind of banked the Abraham Accords, realized there's a limit to how far those are ever going to go, and then think, okay, well, now there are these other options which China/Russia open up for us. And those then in turn spool off other rearrangements in the region at large, right? So what becomes perhaps more the focus all of a sudden are divisions within the Sunni camp. So classically Turkey, Qatar, and when Egypt was under the Islamic Brotherhood, Egypt. That also, I think, is simmering down to a considerable extent, though Syria may remain a flashpoint. But the axis that was Russia, Iran, Syria, now moves into a potential opening for the Saudis, and that then in turn enables the Saudis and other players to begin thinking about defusing the Yemen conflict and potentially even, and this is really, I think, maybe the most shocking news, right? The Saudis welcoming the Hamas delegation from Palestine, nominally as part of the Hajj, as the great pilgrimage, but this is a remarkable leap in diplomacy for the Saudis to be reaching out to the Palestinians in that way, in a direct form. So yes, a lot of moving pieces here. But I think it's the fact that the American position seems so fixed that opens up the possibility for both regional and global reconfigurations for players like Saudi.
You've alluded to the long-standing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There's deep-seated ideological divides that have sort of informed that rivalry. And I'm curious whether deeper economic and diplomatic ties between the states would be enough to kind of make those ideological divisions less salient. I mean, what does history really teach us about that sort of dynamic?
This is the sort of the German question, right? The Handel durch Wandel, the transformation of political positions through trade. I mean, I have a sense that exaggerates the significance of trade in this context in particular. I mean, think about it. Saudi has been supplying oil to Europe and East Asia, starting with Japan and now China, for decades. It hasn't done much to moderate or change the ideological positions on either side, right? I mean, America is Saudi's major security backer for decades. I mean, that too turns out to be compatible with a completely rift in political and constitutional thinking. I don't think this is an example of where one would expect that kind of ideological convergence to happen. I mean, might it contribute to defusing and de-escalating potential tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia? And that's surely what the Saudis are hoping for. I think the smart money and the people who saw this coming were folks who were really tracking MBS's Saudi 2030 vision. And they're having a hard time making the 2030 vision. We talked about this when we did the Saudi episode, this vision of an incredibly infrastructure-driven, service sector-orientated, high-tech, sustainable transformation of large parts of Saudi Arabia. Frankly, it's got a bit of a credibility issue. I mean, it's got a credibility issue because of MBS's reputation. It's got a credibility issue because it just seems otherworldly. It's got a credibility issue because the Emirates are a version of this already existing. So why would anyone prefer to locate in a Saudi organized, kind of globalized capitalist paradise as opposed to the one that already exists in the Gulf and is welcoming Russians and people from all over the world in this moment of tension. So, and then the last element of credibility is that Saudi is a state at war, spending huge amounts of money in Yemen and potentially facing attacks from either the Iranians themselves or Iranian-backed militia of various types. And I think the idea behind this sort of regional de-escalation policy is crucially for MBS to to move to to pacify the region so as to make this economic vision more plausible. So it's rather the other way around. It isn't so much that economics by itself will lead to a realignment, such as the hope that through regional realignment, and the analysts who were focused on this called the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement more than 12 months ago. So this does seem to be like quite a reliable, indicator. They said the 2030 vision is in trouble. It's stuttering. Something needs to be done. And so the initiative seems to be coming from that side. And the Saudi hope will be that if they can kind of normalize relations, then they will attract more foreign investment.
That is an opportunity to take a break here, because we will come back to actually dive some more into the economics of Saudi and Iran. Hi, welcome back. So there's plenty of talk about how this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi could reduce conflict in places like Yemen and Syria and even Sudan, where obviously we're seeing some renewed conflict this week. I'm curious whether, even in the absence of the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, whether we are exaggerating the extent to which that rivalry played a role in those conflicts. I mean, are those countries like Yemen and Syria, etc., already in a position to achieve stability on their own, even outside of that rivalry?
Well, I'm glad we're talking about this, because the Sudan story has been very much on my mind, and did a chartbook newsletter about Sudan this week, because the explosion of violence there is really very alarming. Sudan is a huge piece of the regional jigsaw puzzle. This question as to how far, the instability, violence in neighbors of Saudi Arabia is, as it were, attributable to their internal issues, or how far it's a reflection of the great Iran-Saudi struggle, requires a kind of bit by bit answer, because if you're to take seriously the local circumstances, then you kind of have to. And if you start in the Sudanese case, I think Sudan and Yemen are really closely interconnected. I think the key point is that Sudan is, of course, was divided along religious grounds, and those were not polarizations that really pertained to the Saudi-Iranian clash, but the clash between the north of Sudan and the south of Sudan, and that was a clash between Muslims and Christians. In the northern part, the rump of Sudan, there is, of course, also the major regional and ethnic rivalries, notably Darfur, of course. And those were really the drivers of conflict within Sudan, which went on for decades. And in that conflict, interestingly, though it's you might think it was a long way away, Iran was a major player as a backer of the Sudanese Islamist regime that took power in 1989. They consciously modeled themselves on the Iranian revolution of 10 years before. And Iran responded to this and provided various types of support to al-Bashir's regime. The problem for Khartoum was that in 2011, the south, the Christian part of Sudan, breaks away. And with that, they lose oil, because they were, as it were, a bona fide, a fairly substantial oil producer and exporter, and that's what the regime ran on. And at that point, they become desperate. Iran is in no position to really supply them with resources. And so, in a rather cynical move between 2014 and 2016-17, Sudan lurches into the camp of the Saudi Emirates axis, which precisely at that moment is about to intervene in Yemen. And so at that point, as it were, Sudan flips from being a pro-Iranian to being a pro-Gulf Emirate Saudi aligned player in the system. It doesn't internally produce much dispute, because that is not the fault line. In Yemen, of course, the Iran-Saudi split is absolutely fundamental, but it's fundamental because of the underlying cultural politics of the region, which is indeed split between Sunni and Shia. So the Saudi-Iran split matters if your internal politics align with that force field. In the Sudan case, Sudan flips relatively, as it were, concertedly from the Iranian camp to the Saudi Emirates camp, without that being a major driver of internal conflict. The war in Yemen is very unpopular in Sudan, but that's a different issue. But Yemen itself is torn apart by this division, and in their case, whatever the local grievance is between the Houthis and their opponents, it's quite clear that the politicking on the part of Saudi and Iran has been decisive in destabilizing that country.
Just to clarify here, I mean, it sounds like this cuts both ways. I mean, in places where the Saudi-Iranian rivalry has exacerbated existing conflicts internally, those conflicts are real. Those exist in places like Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. Those conflicts won't go away even if Iran and Saudi patch up their problems.
And we should recognize that the conflict between Saudi and Iran is also not just simply an ego thing, right? Because there's a substantial Shia minority in Saudi Arabia. And the current escalation of tension between the two has a lot to do with a Saudi crackdown, which led to the execution of a very prominent Shia cleric, leader in Saudi Arabia. So the underlying distribution of Sunni and Shia across the region is a major cause of tension. And that's, the anxiety on the part of many of the Gulf states towards Iran is that at various points in its history, of course, Iran has been an active promoter of a kind of pan-Shia activism and revolutionary politics, which is very, very threatening. It was threatening to Iraq. It was threatening to Saddam Hussein. If you remember the Marsh Arabs and the ghastly conflicts in the south of Iraq. Same, it spreads. The same belt of Shia population spreads across the region, and so that's one of the underlying sociological factors in this entire struggle. It's not just a matter of big egos and state power; it's a matter of quite deep social, cultural, and economic divisions.
So finally, I wanted to ask whether it's the broader Middle East destiny and the destiny of its composite powers here, Iran and Saudi Arabia, to be subordinate to outside powers, whether the United States or China, which helped broker the Iran-Saudi detente. I mean, do these countries need to be aligned with Washington or Beijing? Or is this whole alignment, non-alignment concept not really relevant in this instance?
Yeah, I kind of want to get on a soapbox about this. I don't think either maybe the alignment issue, but certainly the subordination term is really an unhelpful way of thinking about the current situation. There's a bit of me that wants to kind of lecture Americans. The fact that you've suddenly woken up to this alarming situation where China is doing diplomacy in the Middle East. It's this has been going on for a long time. Like, America's influence in the region has been waning in such a dramatic way over a period of more than a decade. And it goes back, of course, to the disaster of 2003 in very central ways that we talked about on the occasion of the anniversary. No, I mean, I would see this whole region and much of the wider world as well as caught up in a dynamic of increasing multipolarity, right? That's the central logic here. If you think about the history of the region, it really was, after all, part of the Ottoman Empire. And then as the British destroyed and dismantled the Ottoman Empire, and as it dismantled itself, and as Arab and other nationalist movements broke it up, what happened was a kind of new form of hegemony under the British, which was very real, and where one could really speak of many of the Arab states, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Oman. It was true client states of the British, to a lighter touch form of hegemony under the Americans, really from the 1970s onwards, a little bit more robust with Iran's revolution and then with Iraq. But nevertheless, really a centrifugal tendency taking over. And then with the fiasco of American politics in the region in the last 20 years, that centrifugal tendency has built very dramatically. There's rapid population growth around the region. There's very, very considerable economic growth on the back of the oil price hikes of the 70s, which have led to really dramatic economic development across the region. And so, no, the underlying story here is one of a prolonged, gradual, decades-long, half-century-long autonomization. A move away from what was before absolutely an imperial order, and is increasingly one essentially of a kind of decentralized, that's not even quite the right word. There's nothing very decentralized about Saudi Arabia, but certainly it's its own actor playing in a force field other very significant other players. I mean, for a while there, the Emiratis were hugely active, essentially, certainly collaborating with the Americans, but pursuing their own very assertive policy. Turkey is a huge player in the region. We've spoken about Iran. And so this is a multipolar struggle in which the ability of any outside actor, be it the Chinese, the United States, the Europeans, the Russians, to control this is very, very limited indeed. So that would be my kind of, I think these are the glasses we've got to put on and keep on and really, understand as the trajectory here. China just saw a diplomatic opportunity to do some business, to make a positive difference in a region they care about, because they're potential major clients. They're certainly major sources of energy. This seemed like an open goal, for anyone who wasn't committed to the particular set of set in stone positions America's in. There looks like a deal that should be possible here.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate, I guess. I mean, doesn't the very term of superpower, which we always use, we talk about the United States, we talk about China as potential superpowers, doesn't that imply not that these countries can control what's going on everywhere in the world, but that somehow they're structuring what's going on, that this rivalry between these two superpowers is somehow, helping shape the context in which all of these other kind of powers are operating. Is that more sensible?
Wouldn't disagree with that. Yeah, wouldn't disagree with that at all. That's certainly the case, obviously. But Saudi has that kind of leverage too. When they decide oil production policy in OPEC Plus, everyone feels the force of that, including the United States, and to the vast frustration of the Biden administration. The Saudis have shown zero willingness to even not even forget comply, even show polite regard for the position the Americans are taking on oil. So that's precisely why I think of Saudi as one of these kind of players. It sets the terms for other actors, not just within the region, but globally. Turkey sets the terms for other actors regionally, for instance, to a very considerable extent. It's a huge influence across, the politics of Libya, for instance, or Syria. So absolutely, that I think is a really good way of measuring, not as it were just, command and obey, but structuring conditions. And that's precisely the grounds on which I would argue for an increasing pluralization, is that lots of actors have the capacity to do that in this system.
Okay, we'll leave it there for now. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.